Hello, and welcome to today's situation report. We're talking about what's happened in Ukraine along the front and behind it. What certainly stands out there is the alleged possible Ukrainian counteroffensive. We'll take a look at what's currently being reported about that. But we also want to talk about the Russians' self-sabotage. Because after Elon Musk shut down Starlink for the Russians are obviously convinced that their communication problems aren't big enough yet. And that's why they're starting to block the use of Telegram, which is needed at the front. We'll discuss that and everything else to report from the front and behind the lines. Afterwards, as usual, there will be a Q&A, but no Twitch stream today. My friends are visiting from Germany, so I'd rather spend time with them than play games on Twitch. I'm sure everyone understands. And for those who don't know, this in the background is the newest member of the family. This is Krimheld. She was picked up off the street because she was thrown out of a car window. And for those who are interested, her leg seems to be completely fine again. At least it seems that way. So she definitely doesn't need to be adopted. And because many people are probably wondering about this. Last time, the internet's battery failed. For some reason, it didn't load. And after 2 days, the power for the internet was gone. That's why last time, after the situation report, it suddenly didn't continue. But today, it should be different, since the battery is charged and everything here is buffered. So we can start the situation report with optimism. Ukraine hit the refinery in Volgograd. That's confirmed by images. And afterwards, a large fire broke out there. However, I can't confirm the exact circumstances, the exact damage, or the extent of the damage at this point. Let's continue with the developments at the front, and we'll start in the Sumi region. There, we've geolocated the Russians south of Novi Sich and north of Novi Sich. That's on the map here. So the Russians have advanced a bit further south. How far they were able to establish themselves there is, of course, another story, especially since this video shows their engagement. Then we'll continue further south. And there's still more there. In the Sumi region, the Russians have entered Pokrovka. Here as well, we've geolocated Russians inside the settlement. In general, what we can currently observe is that the Russians are crossing the border at various locations. Because, quite obviously, the goal is to spread the Ukrainians as thin as possible and tie down as many Ukrainian troops as they can. Overall, it doesn't seem like these are serious offensives. But from the Ukrainian side, of course, they can't just ignore it. That's all from the region. There have been no changes in the Wolfchansk region. So we continue towards Veliki Burluk. And there we have a geolocation from the village of Chuhunivka that's geolocated here and there. The Ukrainians fought Russian soldiers there successfully, which in turn means that Russian soldiers had entered the village, even if they were later defeated. So here too, in the direction of Veliki Burluk, there is still activity. From the Russian side, I have no changes from Kupiansk itself. However, southeast of there, we have geolocated the Russians at a new position, namely here on the eastern edge of Chuhunivka. In the last few days, we've seen several larger advances by the Russians here, but it's not clear how much they've managed to hold on to those gains. But the Russians were recently in Petropavlivka, in Podoli, and now in Kurilivka. So we can see that the Russians are trying to push in the bridgehead after they were largely defeated in the city of Kupiansk itself. That's it from the region. In the direction of Barowa, we haven't seen any changes. Towards Liman, we've geolocated. A new incursion into the city of Liman itself, we've geolocated that. Here on the northeastern or eastern edge, whichever way you want to put it. It must have been around here, so we have Russian presence inside Liman again, which is now happening more and more often. These are probably still just infiltrations, but of course they're becoming more frequent and therefore show a certain trend. Towards Sloviansk, we have a report from the Ukrainians stating that Russian soldiers crossed the frozen Siversky Donets River and then carried out infiltrations. So for the moment, the cold weather is obviously an advantage for the Russians, because it allowed them to cross the river, even despite its width, and otherwise it's considered an obstacle for the Russians in their advance. In this case, they were able to use it to their advantage. Additionally, we have the Russians south of Nukivorivka at a new position. And that's, if we're not mistaken, exactly here. And the Russians are roughly at this spot. So, here too we continue to see Russian activity toward Kramatorsk and Slovyansk. And all of this here. These changes have happened in the last few weeks, where we see the Russians slowly working their way closer to Kramatorsk and Slovyansk. That's it from the region. From the direction of Kostiantynivka, I haven't seen any changes that mean anything. We have a few geolocations here, but all within the contested area, so they're not really significant. However, from the direction of Dobropilya, we do have a change. There was a Ukrainian attack on the Russians in Novy Donbass. I think I showed you about 2 or 3 weeks ago that the Russians were spotted at the southern edge, roughly here, of Novy Donbass. And we have now geolocated it here, that Ukrainian soldiers are fighting against Russians in Novy Donbass, which means that Russians were at least there temporarily, which means that the contested area has probably spread somewhat in the northwestern direction here. I have no notable changes to report from Pokrovsk, but once again, I do have a Ukrainian report. And there they say, Russian attacks in the rear area have noticeably decreased since Starlink was shut off for the Russians. The Russians have used many Molnir drones in the region, which used Starlink, and these Molnir drones then dropped first-person view drones far behind the front in order to carry out battlefield interdiction. That is, to prevent Ukrainian supplies from getting close to the front. And there, the shutdown of Starlink for the Russians has obviously had a relieving effect, an immediate relieving effect for the Ukrainians. The next changes I can note are again from the Huljapole region. And there, we now have the Ukrainians in the village of Kosivtseve, which is directly south of Ternowate. That means, after the Ukrainians liberated Ternowate, they are now also in the village located to the south of it. The Russian mill bloggers are talking about a Ukrainian counteroffensive, as we can see here. This is Alex Parker returning. I don't know exactly what the mill blogger's name is. And this is Reba. And there too, they are talking about Ukrainian counterattacks taking place, and about how much of a counteroffensive it actually is. However, if we look at the scale, at best these are counterattacks, more like counterthrusts, being carried out by the Ukrainians. Only a Ukrainian presence in the contested area has been confirmed. So it seems that the Russians are exaggerating the Ukrainian counterattacks in the region to justify the loss of villages. And we must not forget that the Russians are also massively working in this region to carry out what they themselves call conquering on credit. That means 1 or 2 people break through with an infiltration mission. They have a Russian flag with them and show it, which is then recorded by a drone. And then Russian authorities declare that this village has been taken, even if those 1 or 2 soldiers are no longer combat ready in the region. Now, after the Ukrainians used the Starlink outage there to carry out individual counterattacks, the Russians obviously have to justify the rapid loss of the villages. And that's why it's suspected that this is a glossing over of the situation, just to justify taking on credit. And we also have the Ukrainian armed forces themselves commenting on this. And the Ukrainians say, no, there is no counteroffensive taking place there from our side. That means, while we have Ukrainian advances here north of Huljapole, so Huljapole is at this point here. And while we have been able to observe Ukrainian movement in this direction in recent days, it is clearly not on the scale of a counteroffensive. Additionally, the Russians are advancing directly south of that. We have them here in geolocation, in Salizhnichne. There we have geolocation and practically over the entire area of the village. I'm not sure yet to what extent this has led to a consolidation of control. The flag was also shown, and it was also shown that the Russians were definitely active in the area. So it's possible that the village of Salizhnichne, at least that's how I think you pronounce it, that it was actually taken by the Russians is at least possible, though maybe a bit premature. Of course, here too there's again the possibility that it's more or less just infiltrations, but they don't seem to have encountered much resistance there. Further west of that, towards Orikhiv, we also have the Russians at a new front line position, namely here in Novoandrivka, At this point, which is also geolocated, the Russians are getting closer to Orikhiv from the southwest as well. Here, it's probably just another infiltration. I don't see this as meaning the capture of the village. We've talked about it often enough here on the channel that on the Russian side, individual soldiers, sometimes 1 to 3, are often sent ahead. They simply try to break through as far as possible and establish themselves there. And if enough of these small groups break through and consolidate, then attacks are carried out later. So the mere presence and especially the video of fighting Russian soldiers 5 kilometers behind the front doesn't actually mean that the front has shifted 5 kilometers. That has to be understood in this context. If we look at the whole situation, then that's it for the changes, since the situation is largely unchanged. The Russians are apparently still advancing near Huljapole in the south, while the Ukrainians have managed to stop them a bit around Ternowate. Otherwise, there isn't much movement until we get towards Kramatorsk, Slovyansk, and even here along this front, it's mainly infiltrations. Things are also progressing relatively slowly here. There's not really any movement in Liman either. And it's not clear how much the Russian advances east of Kupiansk have led to any changes. We'll have to take a look at that in the coming days and weeks. In general, though, it's noticeable that the Russians are crossing the front at various points along Ukraine's northern border, and they're applying pressure to tie down the Ukrainians at different locations. And to spread them out and tie them down to a greater extent, we can observe that at several points. But to call that a significant offensive already would certainly be too much. Then we'll move on to troop generation, and there we have a report from a Ukrainian analysis team. And according to that, the Russians have been able to import machines from Europe and Taiwan. We have the manufacturers mentioned here somewhere. These are the companies, including several German companies, where the Russians have managed to obtain, for example, computer numerical control machines. The Russians are using this to increase the production of their own gun barrels. Gun barrels were a critical bottleneck that the Russians had, and they are generally a critical bottleneck for long wars, because barrels wear out, or go bad if you will, when they are used frequently enough. And at the same time, they are very difficult to manufacture, especially in high quality. Russia's capacity to produce barrels for its own artillery and main battle tanks. In 2024, it was reportedly only about 50 barrels per year, which is of course far too low, because gun barrels lose quality after just a few thousand shots, at least with regular artillery. It always depends on the caliber and the powder charge. With World War II battleships, it was more like several hundred shots before the barrels had to be replaced. But in general, it must be understood that barrels have a limited lifespan. The reason for this is that a projectile is generally set into rotation, in most cases at least, if it's not a smoothbore gun. The barrel imparts rotation through the rifling inside the barrel, and this causes the projectile to stabilize in flight due to its own rotation. But to create this rotation, of course, friction has to be generated inside the barrel, which produces this spin through its grooves, and this friction inevitably leads to wear on the barrel and thus to deterioration. First, the precision, and, in the long run, also the safety of use, and of course the range as well, and in the end, it can even lead to barrel bursts that endanger the crew themselves. So, especially in longer wars, of course, it's extremely important to be able to replace the barrels of the cannons from the inside. And there, Russia is quite obviously getting help from companies in Europe and Taiwan that can meet this demand. I don't see any accusation yet that, for example, Liebherr has delivered directly. That would probably be the case. I actually haven't had the chance yet, I have to say, to read the study in its entirety. I assume that it will mainly be a matter of smuggling since it is sanctioned, but it still happens. In this way, European companies are at least indirectly helping the Russians to maintain their military capacity. Then we have a statement in the political sphere from Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. He now blames the United States of America in an interview for the fact that no peace was made. He says, "In Anchorage, we accepted the proposal of the United States." Honestly, you made the proposal and we accepted it. That means the problem needs to be solved. By accepting their proposal, we apparently fulfilled the task of solving the Ukraine issue and striving for comprehensive, broad, and mutually beneficial cooperation. He adds that negotiations can only happen with the Americans, as the Europeans and even the Ukrainians are irrelevant. So far, the opposite has been true in practice. New sanctions are being imposed. A real war against tankers on the high seas is being waged. A violation of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. India and our other partners are not allowed to obtain cheap, readily available Russian energy. Europe has long been excluded from this and is being forced to buy overpriced American liquefied natural gas. In other words, the Americans have declared their goal of economic dominance. So Lavrov is complaining that the agreement, about which no details are known from the American side, which was supposedly made in Anchorage, was not implemented. He also goes on to say that of course they will monitor how Ukraine is armed afterwards. So here too, we see the demands from the Russian side to continue to effectively control Ukraine. They are not backing down from these. Because of course, if the Russians have a say in how the Ukrainian armed forces are equipped, whether it's about the equipment itself or the quantity, how many soldiers and how many weapons systems they have, the Russians can also ensure that if there's another invasion, it will be easier for them than before. And accordingly, a new government in Ukraine would largely have to align itself with the Russians if this is not accompanied by credible Western guarantees. And obviously, Russia wants to prevent that as well. But it is actually the case that, for example, we have a report here from Reuters stating that Indian refineries are largely stopping the purchase of Russian oil. So, many refineries still have ongoing contracts that are being fulfilled. But after that, no new contracts have been made for March and April. So it really does seem that Russian oil exports to India are becoming more difficult. The pressure from the American side has started there and intensified, trying to get the Indians to stop buying Russian oil. And I already mentioned it. After the Russians started having problems because Starlink introduced the whitelist, and now the Russians can no longer use gray imported, meaning smuggled, Starlink systems. In order to communicate at the front and operate their drones at the same time, the Russian government has now decided to restrict access to Telegram, the communication platform, as reported here by Russian media. The official reason given, as reported here in Kommersant, is that the laws were not followed. The Russians are supposed to use an app, a messenger app, provided by the Federal Security Service, the intelligence service. Here, we have Russian mill bloggers who are talking about it. And here it says, the slowdown of Telegram is especially annoying because Telegram is used for communication at the front. Military messengers have existed since I started writing about it. But guess what you have to do to get a smartphone with a firmware update? That's right. You have to buy it and send it in for a firmware update. On top of that, one of the military messengers crashes like crazy on a regular basis, and the phone has to be sent in for a firmware update, which takes at least a couple of weeks. The customer service is below average. Starlinks don't work and will slow down Telegram, and all of this has already made teams respond to military communication. We also have the two majors who are talking about it. Anyone who now claims that Telegram plays no role at the front is either completely ignorant about what is happening at the front or is deliberately lying. And these are, mind you, pro-Russian military bloggers who report that the Russian government is further weakening communication at the front, by now also massively restricting the use of Telegram, by slowing it down significantly. Then we also have international support, which is coming for Ukraine. And there, on the one hand, we have a loan from the European Union in the amount of 90 billion euros, which will be made available to Ukraine for 2026 and 2027. And there is a report from Japan that Japan will probably start participating in the Pearl Initiative, that is, in the purchase of weapons for Ukraine. However, Japan will only provide funding, will help with financing, but only for non-military aid. This means, for example, radar equipment and protective clothing, so weapons, ammunition, etc. will not be purchased. The current Prime Minister, Takaichi Sanae, achieved a landslide victory in the elections and secured a 2/3 majority in the lower house. This means her party can now overrule the upper house if it disagrees with their legislative proposals. And the party can also amend the constitution, even though this would still require a referendum and the approval of the upper house. But Takaichi is now certainly one of the most powerful prime ministers of the younger generation. Or she can't be a prime minister anyway, because she's the only one in Japanese history. But Takaichi is thus one of the most powerful prime ministers Japan has had in our time, especially in recent decades. With this, she has massively expanded her scope of action within Japan, which will be especially significant when it comes to aid for Ukraine. But also with regard to China, you probably noticed that the Chinese were completely outraged after Takaichi mentioned that a Chinese attack on Taiwan would endanger Japan's sovereignty and security. And with that, she effectively said that Japan explicitly reserves the right to provide military assistance in such a case, meaning to help Taiwan repel a Chinese invasion. Since then, relations between the two countries have been severely damaged, and her own population responded to this foreign policy pressure by giving her a landslide victory in the snap elections. And that's it for the situation report at this point.